You may have noticed, from the Summer of Love to the great big Fed cuck circle jerk on the 6th of January, in the aftermath of virtually any event of even the smallest societal significance, Joe Biden's answer is invariably to compare it to the American Civil War.
There's an unfolding assault taking place in America today, an attempt to suppress and subvert the right to vote. We're facing the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War. That's not hyperbole. Since the Civil War.
Old differences forgotten, and no need at all to mention the war. Sorry. What was it again?
The prawn cocktail.
Oh, prawn, that was it. When you said prawn, I thought you said war. Oh, the war. Oh, yes, completely slipped my mind. Yes, I've forgotten all about it.
But Biden has an excuse. He was there. What's Nikki Failey's excuse for taking the most obvious bait this side of a Wile E. Coyote cartoon?
What was the cause of the United States Civil War?
Well, don't come with an easy question or anything. I mean, I think the cause of the Civil War was basically how government was going to run, the freedoms and what people could and couldn't do. What do you think the cause of the Civil War was? I'm sorry?
I'm not running for president. I wanted to see your
That's a good thing.
On the cause of the Civil War.
I mean, I think it always comes down to the role of government and what the rights of the people are. And I will always stand by the fact that I think government was intended to secure the rights and freedoms of the people. It was never meant to be all things to all people. Government doesn't need to tell you how to live your life. They don't need to tell you what you can and can't do. They don't need to be a part of your life. They need to make sure that you have freedom. We need to have capitalism. We need to have economic freedom. We need to make sure that we do all things so that individuals have the liberties so that they can have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do or be anything they want to be without government getting in the way.
Thank you. And in the year 2023, it's astonishing to me that you answer that question without mentioning the word slavery.
What do you want me to say about slavery?
No, you've answered my question. Thank you.
Next question.
Now, I touched on this topic last January in an hour-long video essay about the tyrannical record of one Abraham Lincoln, but I'll tell you a secret. The American Civil War bores me about to tears. I find it dry, I find it stuffy. Look, firearms technology hadn't quite entered the cartridge era yet, and as I intimated in the video in question, I really don't sympathize with either side of the conflict, and thus the only party left for me to root for is John Wilkes Booth's bullet. But I study it all the same, and for much the same reason I read Pat Buchanan's The Death of the West. Past is prologue, conspiracy theories are now spoilers, and who the hell doesn't want to watch the sneak previews? From secession movements, to discussion of a draft, to violations of the separation of powers so naked Hunter Biden's getting a foot job from him. Half the time I read the New York Times, I have to check if it's a reprint from 1862. But no one jammed a blunderbuss in Nikki Haley's head hole and demanded she dissemble like the Dickens at an obvious question with an even more obvious answer. But this speaks to the credibility deficit of this cackling neocon crack whore. Sure, the question was more loaded than an Amtrak driver, but if Nikki Haley knew the first thing about the first fucking thing, she could have used the opportunity to educate the public on the difference between the contributive causes of the secession crisis and the Civil War itself. Two distinct but interrelated events with distinct, only occasionally interrelated, causes. Take this goddamn goof on Twitter, regurgitating the tiresome refrain of "a state's right to what?" A vacuous meme that's made the rounds on the interweb of late, and like all leftist memes, it's distinguished only in its remarkable capacity to make not the faintest bit of butt-fucking sense. To which the obvious rejoinder remains, a state's right to secede, you world-smashing retards! What a revelatory discovery you've uncovered there, Shackleton. I'd name a landmass in your honor, but where would I find one larger than your goddamn ego? As my Lincoln video happily stated, slavery was most certainly a cause, primarily of the secession crisis, particularly for the states which initially seceded. Of the 13 states which would ultimately secede, just 5 cited slavery in their much-touted Articles of Secession as a causal contributor to the act itself. A significant admission for 2 reasons. First and foremost, because 5 ain't even half of 13. If 13 people died, 5 of the flu, and the remaining 8 from goddamn gunshot wounds, no sane person is gonna say 13 people died of the fucking flu. That would be what the Bard would call a fucking lie, you leering shit smear. Secondly, it predictably fails to concede why slavery was mentioned in those seceding documents. To repeatedly protest federal regulation or allowance of the institution. Hence, their rejection of the Corwin Amendment, which would have rendered the institution permanent. It's an ugly fact of fucking history, but some people were property at the time, and thus it's awful tough to complain about federal overregulation and taxation of commerce without mentioning slavery, sadly one of the primary engines of commerce at that time. And yes, friends, that means in order for defenders of Lincoln to argue that the Civil War was fought only over slavery, they must first necessarily concede that the entire war was in fact fought over economics! You can somewhat sell the slavery caused the secession crisis argument, at least to the abject ignorant, but it's a tough road to hoe arguing Fort Sumter was about slavery when there was nary a slave in the fucking thing and not a single casualty resulted, even if there were. But the fact remains, the Confederate secession and the Civil War are 2 separate events with their own unique, if occasionally related, causes. And the fact that the modern revisionist narrative requires the conflation of those 2 is prime indicia that their arguments are ass over tea kettle awful. My follow-up to the original Lincoln video has been sort of broiling on the back burner for some time, but for the purposes of addressing the idiocy espoused by the team of trained orangutans that handle the Twitter account of the Chester-in-Chief, how not about slavery was the Civil War itself? Well, I mentioned Lincoln refusing to treat with the Confederate Peace Commission early on when things weren't looking so hot for the Union. What I planned to mention in the follow-up video is that a separate Confederate Peace Commission was dispatched late in the war, with the Union now firmly assuming a victor's posture. And this time, stinkin' Lincoln agreed. On the Union side were Lincoln himself and Secretary of State Seward. And perhaps one of the reasons he actually agreed to meet this time is that the head of the Confederate Commission was lifelong Lincoln ally and Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, whose association with the dictator-in-chief dated back to when they were both members of the Whig Party. Now, Stephens is a name you'll hear often from the armchair intelligentsia on History YouTube, as one of his most famous quotations amounted to an impassioned defense of slavery in the Confederacy, this being the smoking gun the statists wield whenever any counter-argument about slavery as a driver of the war is proffered, which is hilarious when you really think about it, as this gaggle of goddamn idiots are essentially arguing that the South fought for slavery because of the words of one of Abraham Lincoln's closest allies in professional politics, a former member of his party, and a man who, to that point, shared virtually all of Abraham Lincoln's political positions. Okay? Now, the reason I mention this meeting is that it's elucidated by eyewitness testimony in Paul Escott's amazingly titled book, What Shall We Do with the Negro? And whether you're arguing slavery started the Civil War or merely became a convenient reason for the war later on, this politically incorrect tome should prove an illuminating read indeed. During said meeting, not only did Lincoln describe the Emancipation Proclamation as, and I quote, a war measure only, and like any war measure would be null and void upon the conflict's conclusion, but once the subject of the new 14th Amendment, not the Corwin Amendment, the one that, unlike Lincoln, actually freed the slaves, was broached, Abraham Lincoln tables an offer to the Confederacy it's clear he put considerable time into crafting. If the South will consent to return to the Union, he argues, then if for no other reason than sheer force of numbers, the 14th Amendment would be mathematically guaranteed to fail to pass. I repeat, if Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, got his way in this meeting with the Confederate Peace Commission, not a single slave would have been freed. So wait, if the Civil War was only for the South to protect slavery, and Abraham Lincoln presented a proposal that would have protected it explicitly, why didn't the South accept? It's almost as if it left unaddressed the paramount concern of the Confederacy, that the federal government should allow sovereign states to regulate their own economies, trade with their own allies, and in essence to govern themselves without the say-so of the federal fucking government. A fact the Confederate Constitution ties a great big bow on by outright banning protective tariffs of any kind. Hell, half the time the Lincoln cult attempt to prove their premise, they only accomplish the exact opposite, such as when Lincoln scholar Doris Goodwin, very much a believer in the Honest Abe myth, half-assedly attempted to prove Lincoln was only vaguely aware of the Corwin Amendment. You know, again, the one I mentioned would have made slavery permanent ahead of the Civil War, only for her to unwittingly uncover primary documents in the form of personal correspondence that Abraham Lincoln was, in fact, one of the primary authors of the fucking Corwin Amendment. A fact that becomes particularly interesting when you consider that in his first inaugural address, Lincoln lied his ass off, claiming he had only recently heard of the Corwin Amendment's existence. Honest Abe, ladies and gentlemen. If you wondered why her fawning book Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, was one of the primary sources of my last Lincoln video, now you know, numbnuts. Even pro-Lincoln lies are worth reading, as they eagerly and often disprove them fucking selves. Which brings us to the bullshit at present. I mean, you know Nikki done stepped in it when even the brain drain trust that operates Biden's Twitter account got in more dunks than an NBA Jam arcade cabinet. Look, do I need Nikki Haley to have known any of this shit? Not necessarily. I wish I didn't fucking know it. Though any extrapolation on the subject might have proven profoundly instructive and helpful in an era where, no shit, Civil War era reconciliation monuments are being bulldozed amid an atmosphere of regional antipathy approaching levels not seen since the 1850s. Rocket attacks in Gaza, talk of civil war at home, and let's not forget the legendary limping away from Afghanistan. Who knew returning to normalcy would involve this many explosions? I'm Razor Fist. God fucking speed.
I am no one's master, no one's slave.
Don't mention the war. I mentioned it once, but I think I got away with it all right. So,